Over decades of time, the age-old balance that had prevailed in New Mexico had shifted. Spanish settlers increased their numbers following the new order established by Juan Oñate. The battle at Acoma sent a message to isolated pueblos in the American Southwest that resistance to the newcomers would be met with merciless violence. But the very methods that Oñate utilized to further advance the reach of the Spanish crown were at odds with the edicts of that very same crown. Some Spaniards had their conscience shaken by experiences in the New World. The rules would change, and a system dealing with the Native Americans would emerge: the establishment of missions. From the beginning, the Spanish royal family insisted on friendly and loving treatment of people living in the newly discovered lands. That desire had been put into policy, but humane treatment was hard to find in America. One obstacle was a system from the Reconquista called the encomienda. It gave those who conquered the labor of those living in conquered territory. One early encomendero was Bartalimu de Las Casas. He arrived in America in 1502 and was soon co-owner of a large land grant, along with the right to enslave the people who were living there, which he did. In the year 1510, he became the first priest to be ordained in America. He saw no conflict in enriching himself with slave labor and carrying out the duties of a priest. Then there was the invasion of Cuba, and the cruel violence he saw against the native population created a spiritual crisis. Las Casas emerged from that crisis changed. He gave up his privileged land grant and dedicated himself to better treatment of Native Americans. In that change of heart, he found himself at odds with practically everyone he knew in the New World. Encomenderos had no interest in giving up their slave labor or the inhumane acts that kept them enslaved. Traveling to Spain, he found that many people in power, including those in the church, had economic interest in the system that existed. He did find in the church some who supported him and helped him reach the attention of young Prince, soon to be King, Carlos. In 1515, de Las Casas was appointed protector of the Indians, an official office to advocate for Native Americans to the governors in the Indies. Returning to Spain, Las Casas won the support of King Carlos to found a peaceful colony in the north of Venezuela. The plan was a total failure. Slaving expeditions in the area had made it impossible for Las Casas to gain the trust of abused Native Americans there, and the result was an attack that killed 4 of the men Las Casas had left there. Devastated, Las Casas entered the Dominican monastery. This took him out of the fight for a decade, but then he returned to America as a Dominican friar and immediately got into trouble for opposing slaving expeditions in Central America. By 1542, the year that Coronado returned from New Mexico, Las Casas was back in Spain, writing Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias. Las Casas argued that new laws were needed to stop the savage abuse of Native Americans, and an older King Carlos approved. They were called the New Laws. The new laws prohibited Indian slavery and abolished the encomienda system. The new laws caused riots in America, and threats were made to kill Las Casas. In 1545, Las Casas was approved Bishop of Chiapas. He was surrounded by opposing bishops and angry encomenderos. Riots broke out again, and bullets were fired at him. By 1546, he was on his way back to Spain. Las Casas returned to charges of treason in Spain. The instructions he left in Chiapas were ordered burned. He was required to defend himself by engaging in a debate against Juan Gines de Sepulveda in Valladolid. Sepulveda argued that Indians were not human beings and therefore had no rights, and wars against them were justified. Las Casas argued that Native Americans were indeed humans with culture, civilization, and social order. Las Casas argued for missions of peaceful conversion of Native Americans to Christianity. In 1561, he finished his Historia General de las Indias and gave it to the College of San Gregorio in Valladolid on the condition that it not be published for 40 years. It was published 314 years later. Enemies of Las Casas denounced him to the Inquisition, and writers of his day declared him a madman and a traitor to his kind. Las Casas retracted and regretted his earlier idea to bring slaves from Africa to take the place of Indian slaves. Today, Las Casas is honored as an early advocate of human dignity, today expressed as human rights. Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca had the attention of King Carlos of Spain. At the least, the young king got to read an engaging adventure. Beyond that, he got to appreciate some of the depth of Native American societies in the American Southwest. Cabeza de Vaca made no secret of his conviction that Native Americans should be treated with respect and decency, and that the king had the power to make that happen. Cabeza de Vaca's convictions would be put to the test when he was sent back to America to become adelantado of the Rio de Plata area in South America. His attempts to defend Native Americans got him arrested for poor administration and sent back to Spain. Cabeza de Vaca was exonerated, but he was never again sent to America. He wrote another report for King Carlos, and it was bound with his earlier account entitled La Relación. It was published as Comentarios. He died in Seville around 1560. Cabeza de Vaca and Las Casas both advocated for better treatment of Native Americans by Spaniards. They both encountered violent resistance and paid a high price for their convictions. They both made their ideas known to people in power. Would the establishment of missions improve life for Native Americans? King Carlos approved the new laws and sent officials to America to enforce these laws. Vasco Núñez Vela traveled to South America as the first viceroy of Peru. He was eager to enforce the new laws, which would end enslaving of Native Americans and would provide them some level of rights that encomenderos would have to respect. The viceroy was killed in 1546. In Mexico, Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza enforced only part of the new laws and avoided rebellion by the encomenderos. Many found ways around the letter of the laws and still exploited the labor of Native Americans, but much of the most egregious abuse stopped. Along the coast of California, one of the largest civilizations was that of the Chumash. The bounty of the sea was not wasted on these ancient people. Cave painting by Chumash ancestors dates back thousands of years. The Chumash lived in over 150 different villages, speaking various dialects of the same language. They were known as bead makers for the work they did with shellfish exoskeletons. They were also known in the region for the plank canoes they built and took to sea. The Chumash also produced beautiful baskets and had extensive trade networks. It was those on the coast that would have witnessed the great ships of explorer Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo. About the time when the De Soto expedition was leaving El Norte and Coronado was returning to New Spain empty-handed, Cabrillo was sent north to explore the coast of California. California was believed to be an island back then. Treasure fleets were sailing from the Philippines, laden with valuable commodities. The prevailing currents brought them to the coast of California on their way to Barra de Navidad and later to Acapulco. Fearful of interlopers and hoping for emergency harbors for the fleet, Cabrillo was sent with 3 ships to explore the coast. His explorations brought him to the area of today's Santa Barbara, the heart of Chumash country. According to the diary of Captain Cabrillo, this first contact was friendly and peaceful. The only evidence of trouble was later with a different native group on Catalina Island, where Captain Cabrillo injured his leg in a fight with the people of that island. He would later die of those injuries, and his first mate, Bartalimu Ferrer, would assume command to continue exploring further north. Ferrer discovered San Francisco Bay and the mouth of the Rogue River in Oregon. Then he sailed south to return the ships and crew to Central America. Cabrillo is celebrated with monuments in El Salvador and in San Diego. Several places and institutions in California bear his name. The Chumash culture survived the encounter with Cabrillo, although it's likely their population suffered from European diseases as a result of this friendly contact. Cabrillo's voyage sparked little interest in California at the time, so the Chumash and the other coastal tribes had generations to recover from any harm his visit may have done. In the American Southwest, Spanish settlers came with missionaries, and a series of missions were built in New Mexico and Texas to convert Native Americans to Christianity and to expand the influence of Spain in America. Under the leadership of Don Juan de Oñate, life in New Mexico was miserable, both for Native Americans and even for the colonizers he brought with him. Oñate's brutal and deadly attack on the ancient pueblo of Acoma sent a message to all the pueblos in the region that resistance to the Spaniards came with a very high price. Little direct resistance occurred when Oñate demanded scarce food and clothing from the pueblos. Some were helped during this awful time by neighboring Navajo. The Navajo had a long history with the pueblo. When they arrived in the region over 1,000 years before, they learned farming and weaving from the Pueblo people. They adopted many of the Pueblo religious practices, though they rejected living in dense cities. The Navajo were trading partners with most Pueblos, and when resistance was launched against Spanish invaders, some Navajo joined Pueblo warriors in defense of their communities. Mostly, the Navajo responded to Spanish aggression by moving further west. Pueblo culture was far too tied to place for that option. Time after time, hunger and poverty was imposed on them. The heaviest burden, though, came from attacks on their religion. The all-important Kachinas, whether represented in dance, prayers, or dolls, were attacked, and in the case of the doll figures, destroyed. It spoke volumes that missionaries were often killed by Pueblo communities. The establishment of missions shifted the economy from the Pueblos to the missions. So-called conversions occurred out of desperation for food, which the Pueblos were required to render to the missions. Labor was also rendered under threat of violence or starvation, leaving the people no time to produce the crops and garments that they had used for trade with the Navajo and Apache buffalo hunters. The result over time was that those who had traded now raided the Pueblos for what little they had. Spaniards did their own raiding for slaves. In the fledgling colony, trading slaves became the main economy. Many of Oñate's settlers voted with their feet, returning to New Spain, but Native Americans could only endure. Pueblo people noted that the hated Spaniards were often engaged in a power struggle. At times, the missionaries exercised power over the soldiers. Other times, the army seemed to call the shots. At least one military governor gave permission to the Pueblo priests to hold religious dances, seemingly to irritate the missionaries. Some small rebellions occurred on isolated locations, but they were quickly and brutally put down. It had been nearly a century since the days of Oñate, when patience ran out. Spiritual leaders were arrested for sorcery. 2 were hanged while a 3rd hung himself. The others set free when the community demanded their release. Together, these leaders did something rarely done in that region. They joined together in an effort to rid themselves of the Spanish interlopers. Runners were sent to each pueblo every day with a knotted cord. The number of knots told the leaders how many days remained before the revolt. Hundreds of Spaniards were killed. The governor had gathered those around the capital of Santa Fe and were soon under siege in the governor's palace. When they emerged to attack the warriors, they were able to escape. As they headed south, the Pueblos shadowed them, but did not attack. All they wanted was for the Spanish interlopers to leave, and that's what they did, all the way to El Paso. They crossed the Rio Grande River and huddled in the mission in today's Ciudad Juarez. The Pueblo revolt rid the country of the Spanish, and one of its leaders, Pope, took leadership over the United Pueblos. Under Pope's rule, all vestiges of Spanish presence were erased. The hated missions were ransacked. All animals brought by the Spaniards were killed, and the Christian converts were unbaptized. The Spanish language was barred. In the aftermath of the revolt, Pueblo country was free of Spanish presence. But for how long? Missions fit the mandate to convert Native Americans to Christianity. That endeavor was often used as rationale for the taking of land and resources from native people. Missions were also valuable to the Spanish for secular purposes. The missions often served as outposts for Spanish expansion. In this way, the missions were successful from a Spanish point of view. They served at least some of these goals in New Mexico and Texas. With raids by Apaches and Comanches mounted on horseback, some native groups sought the protection of missions and even sent representatives to Mexico City to request missionaries. Establishing missions in Baja California was a struggle. Jesuit missionaries had some success, but they were recalled from America in 1767. As Franciscan missionaries rushed in to run the missions, a plan was put in place to establish new missions in Alta California. In charge of this undertaking was a diminutive priest named Junipero Serra. Missionaries and soldiers arrived by land and sea at San Diego Bay. The Spaniards who survived the journey arrived exhausted and riddled with scurvy. One of the ships was lost, and they were soon desperate for food to arrive. Friendly Native Americans greeted the intruders. Just as they were about to abandon the mission, a supply ship appeared. Construction of the San Diego mission then began. It was the first built in Alta California. Exploring the California coast further north, Sarah encountered mostly friendly Native American communities. When in the country of the Chumash, the welcome was especially warm. It had been over 200 years since the Chumash had welcomed Juan Cabrillo, and since that time, special councils had been established among the Chumash villages to prepare them for defense against aggressive intruders. The missionaries under Serra were not aggressive, so their reception by the Chumash was friendly but cautious. Serra decided that Monterey Bay was a good place to build a second mission. While Serra had arrived with a supportive military leader, it was more common for religious and military leaders to be in conflict with each other. At that first mission in San Diego, the religious leaders had the mission moved 6 miles from the Presidio because of that conflict. The mission was attacked by a large indigenous force. One of the priests and others were killed, all without the knowledge or assistance from the distant Presidio. Similar situations developed repeatedly as the mission system grew and missionaries and military leaders struggled for control. The mission at San Diego was rebuilt, and it later prospered economically. At Monterey Bay, a mission at Carmel was built. This became Serra's favorite mission, even as others were being established. From the Franciscans' point of view, the missions were established for conversion of Native Americans to Christianity. To Spanish officials, the missions asserted Spanish control further north into California. For Native Americans, the California missions were death traps. California was heavily populated with hundreds of native groups, but most were widespread. Gathering them into missions in concentrations made the spread of European diseases especially deadly. The California mission experience created moments of connection between European and American cultures. And it's clear that missionaries believed in the work they were doing. But respect was often lacking for Native American ways, and treatment was often inhumane. The work they were required to perform demanded a very different use of energy than that to which they were accustomed. The work was hard, and their lives became highly regimented. Slaves to the missionary fathers as well as to the clock was baffling at best, and Father Serra and other priests lashed at their flesh with whips for even minor offenses. Running away was considered a major offense. It was usually military leaders who led punitive raids on Indian villages, but some were urged by missionaries themselves. Whatever the aim of the missionaries, the California missions were disastrous to Native American communities. Junipero Serra's energy and dedication are greatly admired, earning him sainthood. He's honored as the father of the California missions, so central to the image of the state. Most of the missions were successful economically. Settlers were sent to California almost as soon as the mission system started, and resentment of the missions goes back almost as far. While the missions were supposed to turn their land over to Native Americans, most of it fell into the hands of a few landowners. The buildings themselves were abandoned, and they deteriorated. Native Californians who survived these death camps lost the land that had once sustained them, along with much of their culture. As for the structures, we can admire the architectural beauty and the dedication of those who built them, but there was a huge price paid by California's Native Americans.